Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%.
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
With Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast. My guest today is Dr. Moshe Daniel Block. We're going to talk about the letting go of free will, the healing ancient belief systems inherited through Torah. So I think this will be a very interesting interview. Dr. Moshe is an accomplished naturopathic doctor, author, and pioneer in mind-body healing. He's an advocate for a philosophical approach to healing, which we're going to go into. So welcome, Moshe. Thanks for coming.
Thanks a lot, Richard. It's a pleasure to be on with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background and what got you into the mind-body connection of healing.
Yeah, so, I grew up as a pretty sick kid. I had everything going on, lots of injuries too with sports. And I just kind of got sick of getting injured and being sick all the time. So I wanted to learn how to help others to, so they wouldn't have to experience my fate. Of course, can only work with a certain number of people at a time, but that was sort of the motivation there. And so I decided to study naturopathic medicine because I like science a lot, and naturopathic medicine is very well rooted in science, and then it has its special modalities of that are unique to the healing power of nature that you won't see in conventional medical training, like acupuncture, homeopathy, and like a good kind of nutrition, not just sort of like the basic, you want to eat your wheat bread and drink milk, like that's like the way I think things are maybe moving along a little bit, but that was always the standard considered healthy diet. So yeah, I then had my own experience with illness where understanding of the false belief that I was carrying about myself led to a massive breakthrough when I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease called myasthenia gravis. And that was 25 years ago. Actually, sorry, that's almost 30 years ago. Almost 30 years ago now. And that belief, like recognizing that I didn't need to be perfect, which I believe that I did, was actually what helped me more than everything combined by a whole quantum factor more powerful. So I realized that the mind is a very, very powerful place for healing. It's really good. Like we can do things at the level of the body for sure. Detoxification, nutritional support, things like that. But there's nothing compares to the power of healing the body by recognizing how the body is reflecting a false belief system that the person is choosing to believe, essentially.
What do you mean? Well, you say a false belief about what? Someone's illness, or a false belief about their diet, or I'm not sure what you're saying.
Oh, very good. Excellent question. Thank you. So yeah, it's a false belief system about themselves. The false beliefs that affect our health the most are the ones that are intimately connected with our definition of our identity. And they often start with an I am statement. So I am not good enough is the most common false belief that people have. There's always, for every individual, there's subtle nuances to what that means for them. But really, the false belief is I am not enough. I'm not good enough. I will never succeed. I'm a bad person. I'm ugly. I'm good for nothing. These are false belief systems that people pick up. They learn from, it could be a direct, quote unquote, educational experience by somebody telling that to them. They could pick it up from their loved ones that they love their parents, and their parents harbor the same beliefs about themselves, and parents see how they treat themselves, like the child sees how the parent treats themselves, and they'll emulate that and they'll adopt that false belief. There's lots of different ways that we can adopt the belief, but that's the kind of belief that I'm talking about that will greatly influence somebody's health and be the seed starter for the process of illness, which culminates in the body's expression of that illness at the physical level.
What would be what belief did you have when you're in myasthenia gravis? Or, I mean, it sounds like it came to you out of the blue and you didn't have a belief surrounding it.
Yes, that's right. Yes, there was an event that triggered it for sure. It was a bad breakup. It was a series of events. My grandfather passed. I had a bad breakup, and then I had a bad experience in the dental chair. So it was sort of like a perfect storm. But the belief at that first time, I've had two major experiences with autoimmune disease. One was 30 years ago, and the other one was a flare-up about 10 years ago. And that was a lot more, it was a lot worse. The belief that surrounded the first one was, I believe I need to be perfect. And when I deemed myself not perfect, I was my own judge and jury and executioner. I would then, execute myself by being hard on myself, saying, "Oh, stupid," the internal face palm to the forehead. That was that time. And then the next time was I had some very powerful false beliefs, wrong thinking around what being a father would be like. So when we got pregnant with my wife and I at the time, when she got pregnant, I thought my life was over. And I incepted myself that my life is over because I thought having kids, I couldn't pursue my dreams anymore, which is true to a certain extent, but it's a half truth. The other truth is that it really has brought me ever deeper to what I really wanted. But I didn't realize that at the time. But that was a very powerful false belief that I incepted myself in. Do you know what I mean by incepted myself?
From the movie Inception, you mean you made the belief yours? I mean, the belief became what you thought about yourself? Is that what you mean?
Like I implanted it. I implanted it deeply into my psyche. It just got right there, right to the core. And I it was a very big life lesson. And I realized that it was silly at the time, but it certainly did seem real. So that was like another belief, a false belief that I had experienced, and which severely debilitated me. The second time, like I was very, very sick the first time, but the second time I was struggling for breath for many months on end. It was just day to day. Am I going to get enough air today to survive, to live? I was paralyzed from head to toe. My wife was dragging me around on the floor. It was very intense, very intense.
So how did you come out of it? What started to happen, or what did you realize?
Well, the first time that I got very sick, it was a spontaneous healing when I realized I didn't have to be perfect, because attached to the belief I needed to be perfect was this harshness against myself for not being perfect. And that is what I have determined and seen in most of my cases of autoimmune disease that I work with, that the person has some kind of attack against themselves. They're beating themselves up, they're harming themselves, they're angry at themselves, and that energy turning against themselves is what the body then ends up doing, is reflecting the energy that the person is doing to their very own self, which is self-attack. So autoimmune is where the immune system attacks itself, and that's what I experienced. So I had a spontaneous healing from that whole cascade of attacking myself, and my arms got strong, my eyes cleared up, I could breathe, I was like dancing. Very soon after releasing the belief. The second time I got sick, it was a quantum level deeper. It was dealing with another issue, which was much deeper for me. And I got better slowly, incrementally, one step at a time. I could get into some more details, but I don't know if you wanted me to go into the details of what I did or what was involved. But
yeah, I did, right? Because, otherwise it's, just saying it happened really doesn't give people an idea on how to do anything to help themselves.
Right. Well, let me tell you this. So one of the reasons why I believe my life was over is because I was very, very, very like desirous. And I use that word intentionally. I had a very strong desire for enlightenment. Like my whole life was devoted to enlightenment. And there's a bit of an oxymoron there because like desiring enlightenment, I realize now is silly because like who we really are, we are the enlightened one. We are that pure consciousness that is enlightenment. So desiring that is foolish in a sense because we're desiring what we already are. It sets us out on a quest, which is very much like the metaphor the metaphor in the book The Alchemist. The guy sets out seeking the Philosopher's Stone, and he realizes that the treasure is right where he started. And it sounds like a very almost like a cliche spiritual lesson, but it's actually very, very true. It's very pertinent in my case. So because I want,
I mean, a lot of people have to go on the journey. The journey can be physical, the journey can be mental, it can be both. I mean, so it makes sense. Like even if the treasure is right where you're at, your current state, you can't access it. So it doesn't seem too crazy to me.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's why it's a kind of like a half-truth, because there is still some kind of a journey that we go on. But the journey is within. The real journey is within, not external, not seeking something from the outside. That's an illusion. And that leads to suffering. It just leads to a lot of suffering, to believe that what I need is outside of me. And that's the basis of my practice is I help people realize what they're attached to, that they believe they need for their well-being. And it's always
What's an example of that? So what's like a really striking example of someone you worked with?
Yeah. So a striking example, it starts in childhood. And what a child doesn't get, which they ought to get, they should get, they deserve it, they're entitled to it, their parents should give it to them. But then the parents are busy or they're wounded themselves and they're not present. So the child feels like, oh, like my dad or my mom or both of them, they don't have time for me. And if they just had time for me, if they spent time with me, if they gave me attention, then I would be okay. So the belief system gets formed around an actual wound, a real situation. The problem is that the child then grows up and that propagates into life where they believe they need attention from others in order to be okay. So that's how the belief forms. And the secret there is for the person to recognize the belief and then to reparent themselves, to say, okay, I understand why I wanted that attention. I wish I had it, that would have been lovely. But who I really am, I don't need attention to be okay. That is a conditionality that leads to suffering if I believe that to be true. Because if I don't have attention, I suffer because I think I'm not okay without it. And if I'm getting attention from someone, then the suffering will result from me and for them because they are the means to my happiness. Like I need them to keep giving me attention. So I have them on a string or a rope, whatever. And I don't feel fulfilled just inherently, just naturally. So That's an example there. And I was telling the story how, because I desired enlightenment, one of my paths that I've worked closely with is alchemy. And I absolutely love alchemy. And it's a great path. But I was so hell-bent, to use that word, again, it's kind of a good word, to become enlightened that I broke some of my rules in the lab and I worked with toxic substances. It was this glittery promise of making the philosopher's stone with antimony, and I heavily poisoned myself with antimony, and it contributed to my severe illness. So I needed to just detoxify from that heavy metal. But the first moment that I felt healing was when I realized that I had put my life, and even to a certain extent, the health of my family, my baby to come and my wife, I had put them after my desire for enlightenment, and my own health after desire for enlightenment. Like, whatever it takes, I'll do it. So I felt it click inside of myself, and the flow of energy, healing energy start. That was the first moment I felt any kind of healing start, when I realized what I had done, what I realized where my values lay and what I was desiring. So that was the first step towards healing. And there are many others, that just involved unattaching myself, unbridling myself from the belief that my life is over now that I have children. I mean, in a way, it just began. There's a chapter, right? Like there's something that begins for a person when they become a parent that they didn't know before that. So yeah, so there's been many lessons.
Yeah, I thought that a bit too when my oldest was born, but my wife was really, we worked together, and I tell people, I mean, it's kind of going off on the side, but I tell people that are having their first child, like, work together with your spouse, because if you don't, if you both say, well, I'm staying up, so you're staying up, everyone's miserable. But if you work together and help each other, and you watch the baby while your wife sleeps, or vice versa, or she lets you do this or that, it just works out a million times better. So it's just, I guess, unasked for generic parenting advice, but that's what I found.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And having the teamwork, it's like being at war in a way, like, okay, your first watch. We're not going to both stay up. Like, otherwise we're going to be exhausted when the enemy attacks.
Yeah. Yeah, that throws diapers at you, yeah.
Exactly.
All right, so you realized this, and then you said you started to, feel better? Like, how quickly? What did you notice?
Well, I started to feel a little bit better. I started to be able to breathe a little better, stand up a little bit, because I couldn't even stand. But it was a slow process the second time. It wasn't like this incredible spontaneous healing that I had the first time. And when I work with people, it's anywhere in between the spontaneous, powerful healing to a war of attrition, where it's a long period process of the person grappling with who they are and their beliefs, and getting drawn back into the desires, getting drawn back into the false narratives that they've painted for themselves. So yeah, it's anywhere in between. It really depends on how hooked in the level of trauma, how unhealthy the childhood was, and the level of trauma, how present their parents were. Was one of their parents a little bit loving, or they were both just really violent and absent and condemning? And, like, the more unhealthy the parents were, the longer the healing can take. And I don't want to paint a belief system around that, but it's a general rule, right? So, like, a person can have had a horrible childhood, like one that I just can't even believe they survived, and then have a pretty rapid and powerful healing process too. So it doesn't mean that just because somebody has suffered greatly as a child that their healing is going to take that much longer, but it does tend to go that way.
Okay, what does this have to do with the Torah?
With the Torah? Well, I mean, the Torah, I can imagine it this way. Let's say you're Jewish, and even you're not Jewish. There's a lot of Christians today that are embracing the Torah, that learn the Torah, they're learning Hebrew. Even Muslims, in a way, I don't think they spend too much time there, but they could study Torah. But let's say from the Jewish perspective or Judeo-Christian, there are so many things written in Torah. And if you imagine you grow up in the mindset that this is God's will, this is God's will, and therefore you commit it to memory in such a fashion that what is written becomes written in your heart and in your mind. Yeah, I'm getting over a walking pneumonia that everybody has around in my community around here.
Really?
Where are you at?
I'm in Austin, Texas. What about yourself?
Oh man, I love Austin. I was just there. I was on the way forward with Alex Zek.
Okay.
Do you know Alex Zek? He's also in Austin.
I've heard the name. I don't know him,
Okay.
pretty much at all, but I've heard the name, yes.
Yeah, it was a nice experience. Well, I mean, we can adopt belief systems in many ways. The personal belief systems that we adopt are often through our parents and our siblings growing up that way. But then there's these collective beliefs that we can adopt by the religion that we grow up in or the culture that we grow up in, the country, the state, the road where we grow up. There's all kinds of beliefs, like according to our race, if we're Caucasian or African American or Chinese or whatever, there's all kinds of invitations, and there are certain alluring natures of these beliefs, because when you adopt a belief for a group of people, it helps you feel like you belong. And one of the biggest issues that I've encountered in my practice is a lot of people will not even go into the possibility or create any kind of possibility that they might be unaccepted or excluded or shunned by their group, their ethnic group, their religious group. So they live within the shadow of the group's identity. And, for the Judeo-Christian and specifically for Torah beliefs, the beliefs are extremely strong, such that the mind is supported by the group. Everybody's thinking together these thoughts. Everybody has adopted the thoughts together as a group, as a body. And so they become all the more powerful, all the more intense. I remember when I broke up with a woman in the past, whenever it was, I was hurting a lot. And there was this feeling that I had. And I went into meditation. I went deep into the feeling, and I uncovered this awareness that I was believing. I literally had the words, "It's not good for a man to be alone." And that's a passage in Genesis. It's not good for the man to be alone. I shall make a helper as a complement to him. So I literally saw, and I was shown that I'm holding this belief because it's encoded in Torah. So I kind of carried in my genetic code. I was born and raised Jewish and, bar mitzvah and all that stuff. I was carrying this code, this idea that comes from Torah. It's not good for the man to be alone. That's a half truth because to a certain degree, it's not good for someone to be alone, right? But it's absolutely okay to be alone, especially after a breakup. You reconvene, you reassess, you connect with yourself again, you detach from that person if that relationship ended, right? So that was one of the first times I recognized that I was carrying a belief of Torah. Another simple example came right at the tail end of that. It's not good for man to be alone. I shall make a helper as a complement for him. So the belief that the woman is man's helper. And certainly we've seen that play out and how that works out. And there's certain cultures that still choose to believe that. But like what you said, a partnership is certainly going to serve the couple better than a codependent, you serve me and I am served.
Yeah, you can both be helpers to each other, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Then the love flows both ways. It's a greater love. It's an augmented love. And each person can embrace and embody the masculine and the feminine rather than these polar splits where the man tends to be masculine, the woman tends to be feminine as extremes. That's the biggest example of a codependent relationship is where the man identifies as strictly masculine and the woman as strictly feminine. And he needs her feminine energy to experience the feminine, and she needs his masculine energy. There are certainly an exchange in that in the relationship, but each of us is masculine and feminine. So when we believe that, the other is the complement, is my complement, I'm masculine, she's feminine, that's a false belief. And it's a powerful one, very powerful one.
And when in the Torah, does it say it's not good for a man to be alone, or is it not good for man, meaning humankind, to be alone? And now we're getting into nitty gritty here, but it does make a difference.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. It's the man. It's the man. We're talking about Adam. We're talking about, and since Adam does represent Ben Adam, basically Ben Adam means the children, the humanity, like children of Adam. So there's both there. It's a good question. It's sort of both there. And I would say, philosophically, we might even be talking about the relationship with God. It's not good for man to be alone, as in not have a relationship with God. So I like that as an idea too. I'll share with you another powerful belief system that I encountered. I'm Jewish, but I practice yoga very deeply. I do Kriya Yoga. I was initiated into the 3 levels of Kriya Yoga, and it was life-changing. And I sort of had a bit of a standstill for a while. I was sort of spinning my wheels in Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And it's not that it wasn't Jewish mysticism's problem, it was my problem, but I was missing something. But I got some keys that are absolutely incredible, and they're not really forthcoming or not very present or not very obvious in the path of Kabbalah. And these keys were totally transformative for me to be able to, it just skyrocketed me back on my spiritual path and deepened my healing. It actually coincided with the second time I got sick, because I had beliefs around yoga, it's not for me, I'm Jewish, that's for other kinds of people, not for me. But I had been recommended by so many people to read the book Autobiography of a Yogi that I was like, all right, I'll read the darn book. And it was like drinking water after being in the desert for a long time. It was just so rich. And I actually learned a lot of Kabbalah from the path of yoga, because it's ultimately a universal path. But understanding about the 4 worlds in Kabbalah, it had remained mostly mysterious to me. That broke open after I learned yoga, interestingly, right? And I began to have really, really profound oneness experiences. And I started to experience a great amount of fear. And, I was saying, I wrote an article actually that said, I used to want to be enlightened. I used to desire to be enlightened. That's the title of the article. And basically, as I started to really understand what enlightenment is, I didn't want it anymore. Because there's a complete, maybe death is not the right word, but let's just use it for the sake of it. There's a death of the ego, and the ego is the one that desires. So it's interesting for the very ego that desires enlightenment to be annihilated in enlightenment. And I started to experience the fear of the ego death. And then I realized, as I got very deep, that as I was merging with God, with the one, that I had a fear of God. And then I realized that I have a fear of God because it's written in Torah that you should fear God, that you should fear God, that it's good to fear God. And that was a very powerful false belief system that I've been working through for years, because God is good, God is love. It's God, I can understand why one might fear God, from the ego perspective, from the infinite, the infinite nature, the undefined nature. It's beyond anything that you can ever, there's no preparation. You can't prepare. You could prepare, for the absolute unknown. But it was just really powerful experience there, Rich, in another recognition of another of these beliefs that I adopted through Torah.
Okay. So I don't know, what is it doing with your faith? Are you re-examining all these beliefs and all that stuff, or what are you doing now? What has worked for you to get rid of your illness and other people's illnesses, and does it coincide with Torah beliefs, or what has to happen?
Yeah, well, the way I work with my patients, when I work with patients, is by asking them questions. I use the process called the VIS Dialogue, VIS, which stands for the Latin, the healing power of nature. Vis medicatrice naturae. And I ask people questions. We start with the suffering as the starting point, and then I ask them, what's that like for you? How does that feel? And what makes you think that? And we go deeper and deeper into the subconscious belief, into the subconscious, to reveal the false beliefs that are lurking there. Because it's almost impossible to change a false belief when at the conscious level. You have to really unearth it where it's dwelling in the subconscious. And that's very liberating, and that's what actually helps people heal from their chronic illness, and that could be mental health, emotional health, but also physical health. And how that relates to Torah, if a person is wanting to experience a relationship with the living God, the living experience of the divine inside of them, then they have to look at the beliefs that is standing in the way of that. And there are many beliefs that stand in the way of that. The very belief itself, that, it's not the time to have a living relationship with God. That was during the times of the prophets and not now. Maybe when the Messiah comes, that's when we're going to have it again. But that's not true. Like the veil has become so thin now that we could walk through it and have the full living experience of the divine again. Especially when we, the more false beliefs you carry, the more you live in your mind, the more you affirm false realities and experience the self, the individual self, like me, Moshe, you, Rich, as the only person in your existence, right? You just experience you. You don't experience the divine in you as you, right? We're walking around experiencing our individual egos. So the more beliefs that we have, the more we affirm that reality of separation from the one, from the divine. And so I really think that now is the time when we have to shed these mantles, these false beliefs, when we have to, each of us has inside of us a divine will and an individual will, and the two can become aligned.
How do you know if something is your will or God's will? If you sit there and you're thinking, what should I do? What should I do? And a thought comes to your mind. Is it from you or from the Lord? How do you know?
That's a very good question. So let me start by answering what I think I can answer here. Is the first thing is it doesn't matter. You hear the voice. There is this principle of like the first thing that comes to you is probably the right answer. So listen to it. Go with it. And you'll learn soon enough if it's right, or you'll learn soon enough if it's wrong. And, in a way, there's no real right and wrong there, because what you get is going to show you something regardless if it's right or wrong. It's almost like what Morpheus tells Neo in the movie The Matrix, where Neo asks Morpheus, she's never wrong. Morpheus says, try not to think of it in terms of right and wrong. She's a guide, Neo. She could help you to find your path. So when you sit there and you go, okay, what is God's will for me? What is the highest truth for me? What should I do in this situation? Who am I? And you get an answer. Well, try not to think of it in terms of right and wrong. Think of it as a guide that's going to help you find your path. So maybe it brings you not exactly in the right direction, but you had to go down that path and find something along the way. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But what I will tell you is this. What brings joy, what you love to do, not in the sense of what you're hooked on or addicted to, or what you feel you need from the outside to make you feel good about yourself, not like that. But what brings true joy and true inspiration and what you find really what you love to do and to be, that is generally the right direction for anybody. And that's individual, right? Like that's an individual experience of the divine and the joy of being the self that is unique for everyone. So there's no prescription there. It's a self-discovery.
Okay. Yeah, it just seems nebulous. I don't feel like any guidance on what to do. Like self-discovery is like, sounds like, okay, you figure it out. I just don't know where to take it from there,
Sure. Well, I mean, let's say I told you, all right, Rich, you're going to build a house. Go build a house. And you're like, what? I have no idea where to start. Like, what would you do? What would you do if I said, go build a house? And you had no idea. No idea. What would you do?
I would start looking into what's required to build a house, but I would more likely look into the tradespeople that can do it themselves and say, hey, I find a general contractor. Hey, man, I need to build a house.
Okay. You're not allowed to hire anyone. This is your task, okay? So again, you said you'd start to look into it, right?
Yeah, I'd have to research and see, all right, what do I have to do? What's the order in which I have to do it? What materials do I need? All that.
Okay. So let's say you wanted to initiate yourself on the task of finding the living God, the truth, the one inside of you. What would you do? What would be your steps?
That's even more difficult. Yeah, you'd have to talk to a whole bunch of people about faith, and then, read either the Torah or the Quran or, the Christian Bible, the New Testament, Old Testament. I mean, you'd have to go through a bunch of documents and see which one seems to guide you in the right way.
Yeah, that's good.
There's one way to do it,
Yeah, that's one way to do it. We are also talking about finding it within, and some of those paths that you mentioned are not really going to help you with that. They're going to help you get into an ancient form of worship of God that, when you really break it down, the divine becomes an external thing. Even though, we do pay lip service to say, well, God is everywhere, and is everywhere, does that include inside of me? We'll say, well, yeah, you can't say no to that. But yet, when push comes to shove, if we really squeeze our beliefs to the surface, a lot of people who follow those paths that you mentioned, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are going to externalize themselves to God. They're not going to find it within. I think maybe the path of Christianity has the biggest invitation there, where the kingdom of heaven lives inside of you, turn over a rock, there I am. Like, basically, it's everywhere. It is in the other religions, but just the way it's packaged, it ends up helping a person become more externalized. So, yeah, one could learn meditation. One could read books. It's an incredible privilege to be alive today and to have so much information. It's a bit of a curse at the same time, but the first thing that a person needs to do is they need to get their internal discernment, barometer fine-tuned and squeaky clean and nicely oiled. So in anything that we do, anything, including, should I eat this apple? Should I drink that? Do I want to go out? And do I want this job? There's an internal yes and no that one can learn to listen to and augment its message. And doesn't mean you're always going to get it right, but again, that's okay. But to really learn to trust one's instinct of what is a yes and then what is a no. It's very simple. So when you're going to let's say you're going to a retreat where you're learning how to meditate or something, you might go like, oh, this doesn't feel very good for me. This doesn't feel right. The teacher is very into their ego and they're teaching principles that some are good, but I don't like all of this. So you need to be able to trust yourself, and it's okay to see something negatively like that. You don't have to be this goody two-shoes. Oh, everything's so good. Everything's so positive. Like, trust your instincts on this path, and that could really lead you to a liberation from relying on external sources to find truth. It doesn't mean we can't use external sources for inspiration. Great books, great teachers, great movies, great whatever, relationships. These are inspiring, but it inspires the inner self. That's the important point there.
Okay. Very good, Moshe. What is the best way for people to start to engage with your line of thought? Should they get your book, or how can they do it?
Yeah, they could definitely get my book, Holistic Counseling, Introducing the VIS Dialogue. That's available on Amazon. If they want to work with me personally, I offer health programs, and they could contact me through Dr. Dr-Moshe, MOSHE.com. And they could contact me. There's a free 30-minute consults and stuff. And then there's the program itself. There's also an option to experience one VIS Dialogue with me to see if it's a fit. It's very powerful. And even one session could be life-changing, really life-changing. That's another way. And then if you're interested in the training, I also train practitioners, healthcare practitioners, naturopathic doctors, nurses, holistic nurses, etc. I train people how to do the VIS Dialogue for healing through the mind. And that would be holistic counseling. It's HOLISTIC -counseling with 1L.ca. So those are the ways to get in touch with me.
Okay. Well, very good, Moshe. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast and, explaining this. It does sound like it's going to take work, but at least there's a path for people to help themselves. That at least to figure out these beliefs that are, holding them back, holding them down, etc., just hurting their lives. So thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and your great questions and for having me as a guest. I appreciate that, Richard.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes. You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And Want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.
They could contact me. There's like a free 30-minute consults and stuff. And then there's the program itself. There's also an option to experience one VIS Dialogue with me to see if it's a fit. It's very powerful. And even one session could be life-changing, really life-changing. That's another way. And then if you're interested in the training, I also train practitioners, healthcare practitioners, naturopathic doctors, nurses, holistic nurses, etc. I train people how to do the VIS Dialogue for healing through the mind. And that would be holistic counseling. It's holistic-counseling with one L.ca. So those are the ways to get in touch with me.
Okay. Well, very good, Moshe. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast and, explaining this. It does sound like it's going to take work, but at least there's a path for people to help themselves. That at least to figure out these beliefs that are, holding them back, holding them down, etc., just hurting their lives. So thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and your great questions and for having me as a guest. I appreciate that, Richard.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed. At findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed. Advice is needed.